welfare project that we're going to do or the community charity project we're going to do
yes,
will buy services from the people who take Canon coin.
Yes, so the idea is that within this local microeconomy, certainly initially in the trial, we've got one shop, the Fruit and Veg Co-op, so you can spend your Canon coins doing that, or you can, yes, as you say, you can do it. You can trade within the community, you can pay for babysitting or you're painting your house. The third thing you can do is to donate to the community fund, and then that community fund gets, so via sort of face-to-face meetings and some tools that we build into the app.
All right, Mark, hey, we're out of time, but thank you very much. Cannons Creek and Aotearoa trialling the Canon coins. Not bad, Brodie?
I love it. Go to the community.
Cool. Hey, and nice to have you with us on the panel, Brodie. Thank you. And Ben Thomas, you too. I'm Wallace Chapman, back tomorrow. I'm filling in for afternoons as well for Jesse Mulligan, so see you then from 1.
Kei te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere Aki nei, nurses' patience is running out as they hit the streets protesting over pay and allegedly unsafe working conditions. The Climate Commission's how-to guide for saving the planet. Should the government pay people to ditch their old petrol-guzzling cars? 3 bubble busters find themselves banged up in isolation after breaking the rules. Fiji health authorities warn against panic as the island nation hits record daily COVID cases. A murdered Northern woman allegedly foresaw her own death. And actor Robyn Malcolm on being sent to the MIQ naughty corner over too many bottles of wine and lighting a candle.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, I'm Marama Tibole. There's just 2 hours left to go of a massive nurses' strike that's disrupted surgery, services and COVID vaccination centres. Tens of thousands of nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants have taken to the streets around the country demanding better pay and conditions. Health correspondent Rowan Quinn's been at the Auckland rally.
Nurses jammed into Queen Street chanting that freezing wages is outrageous. Some are wearing wigs, flowers and old-fashioned nurses' uniforms, but behind the party atmosphere is some real anger. They say after a year of keeping the country safe from COVID, they were gutted at the government's public service pay freeze. And they say it's not just about money, they need better conditions to keep themselves and patients safe.
A Hamilton man supporting the nurses' strike says they deserve better. Kevin Dunseith was standing near Waikato Hospital with a sign that read "Kia kaha nurses" when he spotted the very group of nurses he was striking for.
These nurses looked after my dad. She looked after my dad. She looked after my dad for months and months. Jean, thank you.
Thank you, darling.
District Health Boards say they're hoping to get back around the table with nurses after the strike is over. Wairarapa DHB Chief Executive Dale Olive says they've been working hard to ease staffing pressures, including employing 3,000 extra nurses and midwives in the past 3 years, with a plan to bring on more. She says their pay offer to the nurses is a good one, especially for those on a low rate, and they hope they can get a better understanding of what nurses want when negotiations resume. New Zealanders are being warned they'll have to make major changes to the way they live and work if this country is to hit its climate change targets. The Climate Change Commission's final report lays out the roadmap to slash emissions and become carbon neutral by 2050. The sweeping changes proposed include the requirement for nearly all cars imported by 2035 to be electric vehicles. For agriculture, livestock numbers will have to be cut unless new technology becomes available. Climate Change Minister James Shaw told Parliament action has to be taken now.
Every year of delay makes the effort harder and more expensive than if we just get on with it right now. Those calling for delay, as they always do, are in fact calling for higher costs and greater economic disruption than is necessary.
James Shaw said consultation will now begin and called for cross-party consensus. Armed police officers are investigating a fatal apparent hit-and-run in the Auckland suburb of Mangere in which a firearm might have been involved. The police received multiple reports of a man being hit by a vehicle on Thomas Road just before midday. No firearm has been found. The Ministry of Health has updated its advice and now says pregnant women can receive the COVID-19 vaccine at any stage of their pregnancy. They're part of Group 3, which is starting to receive the vaccination. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says pregnant women can become very sick if they get COVID-19.
Data from a large number of pregnant people who've already been vaccinated around the world has shown that there are no additional safety concerns with COVID-19 vaccines and specifically with the Pfizer vaccine.
Ashley Bloomfield says vaccinating during pregnancy may also help to protect the baby against COVID-19 because there's evidence that infants can get antibodies to the virus through cord blood and breast milk. The first green zone flight back from Melbourne to New Zealand has lifted off. Around 450 people are expected to arrive at about 5:30, with another flight leaving later this evening. While the travel bubble is still paused, the government is allowing some people, mostly New Zealanders, back into the country. Passengers must test negative less than 72 hours before departure. There was just one new locally acquired COVID case in Melbourne today, and the city's hard lockdown will be eased from Friday. It's 5:04. To sport, almost 2 years after playing their last NRL game at Mount Smart Stadium in Auckland, the Warriors are finally set to return. Having spent the past couple of seasons based in Australia due to COVID-19, they'll play the Canterbury Bulldogs at Mount Smart on August the 15th. The match will also double as a farewell for captain Roger Tuivasa-Sheck, who is switching to rugby union. Coach Nathan Brown says it's important Tuivasa-Sheck gets to play at home again before leaving the club.
Roger's probably the greatest influence on the club will probably be in the coming years when he's not here. You know, what he leaves behind is probably going to be a lot more than what he actually just brought as an individual. The fans would really love to see him at home again, and I think for his own family and extended family, it should be a great occasion for him.
Departing Hurricanes and All Blacks second five, Ngani Laumape says walking from New Zealand rugby and heading to France was a straightforward decision. Laumape, who's played 15 tests and 6 seasons for the Hurricanes, will play his final game for the Super Rugby side against the Queensland Reds in Wellington on Friday night. He announced last month he was moving to Stade Francais, but has only spoken publicly about it today, saying he was surprised by the contract New Zealand Rugby offered him as it was a pay cut.
It is what it is, and it wasn't hard when I was offered a contract that asked me to take less. So once that came into perspective, I had to make the best decision for me and my kids.
Laumape's French deal was believed to be worth over $1 million a season. That's the news.
Someone breaks the internet.
When they have a problem, that means we all have a problem. It does make you think about the vulnerabilities that the internet has.
A worldwide sting busts criminals.
The fact that we've disrupted an application that they believe they couldn't be intercepted on is significant.
And there's more vaccine coming our way.
Pfizer have delivered. The only question was, how smooth will some of that delivery be?
Global events affecting New Zealanders. Morning reports, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, also Coromandel Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay cloudy periods with a few light showers clearing for Hawke's Bay tonight. Waikato to Manawatu, including the central high country, fine, partly cloudy tomorrow with the chance of a shower. Orowhenua to Wellington, also Wairarapa, fine, cloudy tomorrow with showers from the afternoon. Nelson, Marlborough, Bulla and Westland, fine today, partly cloudy tomorrow, a few showers about Golden Bay and the Marlborough Sounds. Canterbury and Otago, fine, apart from areas of low cloud. Clouds spreading north tomorrow with drizzle developing inland for Canterbury tomorrow evening. Southland and Fiordland, fine, but some cloud and drizzle about the fjords and rain developing everywhere tomorrow morning, gradually clearing but remaining rather cloudy. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Kia ora rā marama. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Angry nurses have taken to the streets around the country demanding more pay and a safer place to work. They say they were gutted by the government's call to freeze the pay of most public service workers, especially after putting their own lives on the line for COVID. All over the country, the message has been the same. They're fed up and many say they're going to leave the profession or leave the country unless something changes. Our health correspondent, Rowan Quinn, and cameraman Nick Munro have the story.
Nurses say they feel betrayed. We need them right here, Jacinda. Come on. You need to come out of your hiding place and pay us what we are deserving of.
Nolene says it's not just about the money.
Well, we walk like two people, really, get paid for one? Well, not even one, so how is that fair?
In Auckland, thousands of nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants from the city's 4 main hospitals poured into the city to make their voices heard. Their patients waved from windows as they left work. Much of their anger is directed at the government and its public service pay freeze. Charge nurse Luke has a placard with Grant Robertson giving a one-fingered salute.
My sign kind of symbolises the thanks that we're getting from the government for the work, particularly the work we did last year.
Many more had placards making a direct plea to Jacinda Ardern to show them some of her famous kindness. The nurses had asked for a 17% pay rise, but got a staggered offering between 1% and 12%, with very little for senior nurses. Middlemore nurse Jasmine says they just want what's fair.
People think we're greedy asking for more money, but we were the ones working during lockdown. We were there for the people. There might be a party atmosphere in the crowd here today, but there's also real anger. They feel that they've worked so hard to try to keep the country safe during COVID, and it's not fair that they're not getting paid what they deserve.
That's unacceptable. I mean, we've been working through the pandemic, and I don't think that's fair.
In Wellington, Health Minister Andrew Little was on the receiving end of the anger as he addressed nurses on Parliament grounds.
And we're on making progress and we're getting there. And you want a fair pay settlement. So let's carry on working together to get fair pay, get more nurses, get more staffing, have a safe hospital system.
He says he doesn't take the booing personally, that nurses have a right to be frustrated and angry. Pregnancy assessment clinic nurse Natasha says she's proud of her colleagues.
Just to see the outpouring of emotion and, just realise how everyone is feeling very similar and just fed up.
Nurses Margot, Maddie and Magda are brand new to the profession and say they're already thinking of packing it in or going across the Tasman.
It's terrible. The pay conditions and the work conditions, it's not safe. It's not a desirable career.
Audrey's been in the job a long time and says it's about looking after new nurses but also patients. Many placards read, "If we're not safe, you're not safe."
The EDs are overflowing, the wards are overflowing, and we're not even anywhere near winter yet. We're only just getting started.
The DHBs say they're working to get more staff on the ground, with 3,000 more nurses and midwives employed in the past 3 years. They say the pay offer is a good one for nurses, especially those on low rates of pay. Both sides say they're keen to get back around the table.
It is 11 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National, and still to come on the programme, we'll have DHB reaction to today's nationwide strike. The Climate Change Commission has urged the government to get tough on the way New Zealanders live and work in its final advice for reducing emissions presented to Parliament today. But critics have hammered the Commission's agricultural goals, saying it's missed the mark on methane targets. Katie Todd reports.
No more new or used petrol or diesel cars being imported, made or assembled in New Zealand by 2035. Substantially more government investment in cheap, accessible public transport, cycleways and walkways. And no more coal boilers as soon as possible, with at least 95% renewable electricity used by 2030. These are among 33 recommendations detailed by the Climate Change Commission in its final 419-page report released today, which will guide the government's actions to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. For people like Greenpeace spokesperson Amanda Larson, it's all a bit underwhelming. She says there's a major weak spot.
Despite thousands of submissions in favour of climate action, despite huge public mandate out there for climate action, the Commission has failed to really take responsibility for the industry that is causing the most climate pollution in New Zealand, and that is the dairy industry. So there's been no real change in its recommendations, and the dairy industry still gets basically a free pass to pollute.
The Commission wants the government to decide next year on a pricing mechanism for rewarding farmers who reduce emissions. And it says technologies like methane inhibitors, vaccines which can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide burped by cows into the atmosphere, could reduce the country's biogenic methane emissions by more than 50%. But Ms Larson wanted to see strict limits on stock numbers, fertiliser and imported food. Oxfam New Zealand's campaign lead, Alex Johnson, says the Commission is already taking more of a hardline approach for other sectors.
The pathways for reducing emissions in agriculture are simply not consistent with keeping to 1.5 degrees, and that's our largest source of climate pollution in New Zealand. That's around half of our emissions, and so even if we go as hard as we can on transport and other sectors, if we don't directly regulate emissions from agriculture and step up our action in that area, then we're not going to be able to do our fair share to contribute to this global problem.
Meanwhile, Forest and Bird spokesperson Jeff Key thinks there's another blind spot in the report. He wants kelp and shellfish beds re-established on coastlines and measures to stop wetlands drying out so more carbon doesn't go into the atmosphere.
One of the big things that comes out in the report is once we start looking beyond sort of 2030, 2040, we're going to need to protect a lot of our carbon stores in forests, in the sea and in wetlands. And right now the rules are not strong enough to allow that to happen.
Someone feeling more optimistic about the report is NIWA Chief Scientist Dr Sam Dean. He even goes so far as to call it a breath of fresh air. That's because he says there's finally traction on a more comprehensive range of climate policies.
Up till now, we've based our response on emissions trading scheme, which has incentivised plantation forestry. Moving away from that to a broader range of policies that are going to look to actually reduce emissions, especially of carbon dioxide, is really important, and it's something we've not managed to do to date, and it's something we're going to have to start doing really quickly if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change.
Sam Dean says the difficult part isn't the report, it's what the government does to rise to the challenge. He says his plea for the government is to embrace all the recommendations with urgency, and he challenges all New Zealanders to show their support and willingness to make changes.
The government should pay people to send their old petrol-puffing cars to the scrap heap, according to the Motor Trade Association. Transport belches out nearly half of our carbon emissions, with the final report from the Climate Commission recommending a ban on the importation of light petrol vehicles by the early 2030s. But the MTA's chief executive, Craig Pomari, believes it's a step too far, and there should be an incentive to clean up the 5.5 million vehicles on our roads right now.
We don't support the idea of banning petrol and diesel cars coming into the country. If the end game is to decarbonise the fleet, there are better ways to incentivise Kiwis to get into cars that do spew out less emissions, whether that's an EV, whether that's a hybrid, whether that's an ICE vehicle or a petrol and diesel vehicle, as we call them, that has lower emissions than what we have now. Things are always getting better technology-wise, but to think that we should ban from that point, we don't support that. We don't think that's a good idea.
If we don't do that, we're not going to meet our targets. So if the savings aren't going to come from transport and by implementing a ban, who else should make up that shortfall, do you think? Which other industry do you nominate?
Well, actually, we think our own industry can still step up to the mark. The challenge we've got is that everything in the plan is focused on the cars that come into the country every year, which is about 250,000 to 300,000. But actually, if we dealt with the 5.5 million vehicles in the country right now, then we could actually achieve that target far sooner by, one, making sure they're maintained and doing emissions testing on them. If we got that going with the 5.5 million on the road now, that would make a real difference. So it's not about us shifting it to somebody else. We can actually take care of it ourselves, but the plan makes absolutely no mention, Lisa, of the existing fleet of vehicles.
OK, so those 5.5 million vehicles, do you think, well, we should scrap some of those? Like there was a scheme in the UK where you got paid to basically take your dunga off the road.
Yeah, look, we've talked with officials, we talked with the Minister of Transport about the idea of scrappage, and there's certainly interest there, but again, nothing mentioned in the plan. We would be supportive of that, and we would be looking, from the numbers that we've looked at, we'd be putting a marker in the ground at about 15 years. But there's a reason for that. By about 15 years old, the cars in the fleet, or the vehicles in the fleet, something like 53% of them fail off. We know that they are more likely, if they're involved in an accident, our older cars, sadly, if you're driving that one, you are more likely to be the person that dies in a serious crash. So we're saying let's get the worst ones off the road at around 15 years. It then actually means we can open the door to some better, lower polluting and far safer cars.
So what percentage of the fleet do you reckon that is, 15 years or older?
15 years or older sits at just under 30%, so it's just under 1 in 3 cars is 15 plus.
And are you suggesting that those people get cash to scrap their vehicles, or how would it work?
We're working through some thoughts now, which we do want to present to the ministry and to officials. But there's a whole range of options in there. It could be everything from cash in the hand to potentially a credit towards another vehicle that they purchase, but that, of course, would need to be a lower carbon emitting vehicle, or potentially even a credit towards, for instance, public transport. A credit on their Uber, credit on their Snapper card. So lots of ways to deal with whatever the amount of money is. But we think, again, if the idea is to decarbonise the fleet and meet these ambitious targets, let's get stuck in to some of the rubbish that we've got on the road.
Have you got any idea how much that would cost, or what is the realistic amount that you would pay for each of the cars that went to the scrap heap?
Well, some of the figures we're looking at, again, it depends, and we're still working through that. But if it was $1,000 to $2,000, because it's got to be enough to make to make it worthwhile for a change, that is a significant figure. Now, we accept that. That's around $1 to $2 billion, depending on which option you take. But again, if the end game is climate change, we're serious about it, let's decarbonise, then we've got to be prepared to throw some serious money at it, rather than just tinkering around with the flashy bits like the EVs at the front end.
In terms of family vehicles, right? If they don't buy into this idea of scrappage to get cars off the road that way, when it comes to EVs, is there the supply circulating whereby come 2030, those are the vehicles that we import? Is there enough of them?
If I ask my colleague in the industry, who brings in all of the new cars into New Zealand, he would say he would love to have that many cars available, EVs available to sell to Kiwis. They just don't have that supply to meet that target. For them, that's a target that's another 3, 4, 5 years on from that. If we're lucky on the youth side, it's a similar story. Our biggest market is Japan. In Japan, there's something like, it's less than 200,000 used EVs in Japan versus multiple millions of hybrid vehicles. So we are pleased that the government is saying, actually, we won't be preoccupied with EVs, we're open to other things. But right now, if we think it's EVs and EVs only that will get us to that 2029 target, we just don't believe that that's realistic.
In the sense of commercial vehicles, trucks, by 2030 they would like 43% of light vehicles coming in, light trucks coming in 43%, and heavy trucks 18%. Are there the trucks with the same capabilities that can be imported, that are environmentally friendly, or would it require a significant shift in the way people do business?
It's a bit of both there. There are some there, but they're few and far between at the moment. Where we've got some customers in New Zealand or some firms in New Zealand that are actually trialling electric trucks now to see how they actually suit their business. But for some of them, it doesn't practically work. The trucks need recharging. People need stand-down time because they can only drive a certain number of hours, and they're having to bring in extra staff. So from a business's point of view, yes, they want to do the right thing, but actually, practically right now, it doesn't work. And again, Lisa, the answer may not just be EVs. Hydrogen fuel cells is an option for particularly the trucks and the heavier trucks. That's something that's being explored at the moment, and that's something that seems to be working rather well. So again, it's about more than just EVs. There are other options, but from a business's point of view, it's got to work for them.
And it was Craig Pomari, who's the boss at the Motor Trade Association. Homai o whakaaro. Let us know your thoughts on that. Would you hand over or give up your petrol car if the government paid you cash for it, if it's 15 years or older? And how much would it take? Craig's suggesting $1 to $2,000 a vehicle. You could get a credit for public transport. It's saying 30% of the vehicles on our roads are 15 years old or older. Let us know how old your car is. What would it take to, ditch it off the roads? Let us know. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. 3 people breached Melbourne's lockdown to travel to Sydney and then on to Auckland. The COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, says the group will have to spend 2 weeks in managed isolation, which they'll have to pay for. It comes as the first flights bringing New Zealanders who've been stranded in Melbourne because of the lockdown are due to touch down. Here's our reporter, Sarah Robson.
The COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, says the group arrived in Auckland last week in breach of both Victoria and New Zealand's rules.
My understanding is that they provided incorrect information on arrival in New Zealand, and it was our staff at the border doing what they do well that uncovered that and identified that. They were never allowed past the border, so they were held there while that process took place, and then they were transferred to MIQ.
Anyone who has been in Melbourne since the city went into lockdown almost 2 weeks ago has been barred from travelling here. Chris Hipkins says the group is being treated like anyone else who has arrived in New Zealand from a red zone country.
The most immediate consequence for them is that they've got 14 days in managed isolation, which they will have to pay for.
And there could be other consequences too.
There are fines, there are potential fines. Obviously, I don't make the decisions about who gets fined and doesn't, but there are potential fines.
The first green flight from Melbourne is due to land in Auckland this evening, with another flight due in the early hours of the morning. The Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, says they'll be bringing home about 450 people who have been stranded because of the lockdown restrictions.
They must have a negative pre-departure test that has been undertaken within 72 hours of travel. They have to complete the No Mai Rā travel declaration and also complete a specific declaration that they have not visited a location of interest.
The flights are limited to New Zealand citizens and residents, Australians who normally live here, people with humanitarian exemptions and critical workers. The full travel bubble with Victoria is on hold until midnight tomorrow, and health officials will be providing updated advice to Cabinet in the morning about whether that should be extended. Meanwhile, a person with COVID-19 has been moved from the Jet Park quarantine facility to Middlemore Hospital. The person arrived from Malaysia on June the 1st. The county's Manukau DHB says they are suffering complications from the illness and they are in a moderate but stable condition. Ashley Bloomfield is reassuring people there are strict protocols in place about how people with COVID-19 are cared for.
There are well-rehearsed processes for ensuring people are transported safely and, of course, are cared for safely. It doesn't create any risk for other people who are using that hospital facility.
On the vaccine front, the government says 17 new ultra-low temperature freezers have arrived and should be ready for use by the end of the month. 5 of the freezers will go to Christchurch, so there's a second hub to distribute vaccines to the South Island and Lower North Island. Chris Hipkins says that means there will be 23 freezers, including 3 backups for storing the Pfizer vaccines.
That will allow us to store up to 4 million doses at any given time, which is, in our view, should be enough to see us through this campaign.
The Ministry of Health has also updated its advice about whether pregnant women can get the jab, and it now says they can get it at any stage of their pregnancy. Ashley Bloomfield says they can get very sick if they get COVID-19.
Data from a large number of pregnant people who've already been vaccinated around the world has shown that there are no additional safety concerns with COVID-19 vaccines and specifically with the Pfizer vaccine.
Ashley Bloomfield says vaccinating during pregnancy may also help to protect the baby against COVID-19. There's evidence infants can get antibodies through cord blood and breast milk.
Actor Robyn Malcolm says she feels like she's in the team of 5 Million's naughty corner after being bailed out by MIQ officials for lighting a candle in her room and displaying one too many bottles of wine. Malcolm, who's on day 3 of her managed isolation stay at a Wellington hotel, had the candle confiscated after an Instagram post showed it lit, alongside 2 bottles of wine she hadn't opened. But she's hit back this afternoon saying she feels she was treated like a child, and she'll be writing to MIQ officials with suggestions for improvement. Bridget Burke reports.
Robyn Malcolm's countdown to freedom.
I've just learnt how to go on Snapchat. I've got 6 books about Black history in America. I've got a teapot. What else have I got? I've got my yoga mat. I might save my puzzle for day 8. And I've been on the phone a lot.
But one of those phone calls wasn't so welcome. A call from MIQ officials after someone dobbed Robyn in after seeing a social media post.
We have been informed by our PR department that you have put photographs up on Instagram, and in the photograph there is a scented candle, and you're not allowed to light candles, so we'll need to take those from you.
And that wasn't where the call ended.
Also, we noticed in the photograph that you've got 2 bottles of wine and you're only allowed 1 per day. That is policy. We won't take that from you. We'll let you off.
Robyn's friend dropped off to her half a bottle of red wine they didn't like, and the other bottle hadn't even been opened. As for the candle, well, she had good reason for lighting it.
Very smelly and musty, and I could smell cigarette smoke coming from somewhere. That having the scented candle was actually part of wanting to make me feel like I was in a reasonably okay place.
Robyn's staying at Wellington's Bay Plaza Hotel. It's her second stay in managed isolation and she's fully vaccinated. She says rather than asking her not to light the candle, it was confiscated, and she felt like she was treated like a child.
I am not incarcerated. I am a law-abiding, tax-paying, community-minded citizen, and I am sacrificing my personal liberty, which is completely priceless, willingly for the state to contribute keeping COVID out. And to be treated like that, like some naughty kid, is, in my view, so beyond the pale.
The 56-year-old says she left the country after earning nothing in New Zealand last year. She says she has to go where the work is.
I went to America to do a job, and I have to come back and quarantine, and that's the deal. I get that, but it's not by choice. I do it as I said before, as a community-minded citizen, because I have to, because I want to stay in New Zealand where my children are.
She says her hotel room on this occasion is tiny, and while she respects the need to protect our borders, she worries about the impact on mental health for people at some facilities who can't leave their rooms.
We're locked in rooms, and this is a teeny tiny room that's got one source of running water, and we're not allowed to walk out that door. And the impact of that is huge.
Robyn's writing a letter to MIQ officials about no-cost, low-cost ways of improving and streamlining managed isolation stays.
One of the major issues is the lack of consistency across facilities. And people say, oh, well, you know, we didn't have long to put it together, and it's all. And I'm like, yeah, no, you've had a year and a half. And so consistency around exercise, for instance, that's wildly different from place to place. Some people get to go outside and walk all day. Other people get half an hour every 3 days, depending on the facility you're in. Food, again, is a huge one. Like the food I'm given here is predominantly white or pale yellow in colour.
So, would she do managed isolation again?
I may have to, and I want to be able to contribute willingly and happily, and that's why I'm writing my list of suggestions, because, you know, it's one thing to lock the borders down, and, you know, in America, so many people would say to me, oh my God, your country did it better than anybody, better than anyone. And I went, well, yeah, so far we did. We did a beautiful, beautiful job of keeping COVID out. But to be able to continue to do that until we can finally vaccinate everybody, you need the team of 5 million on side. And you also, I would say, I'm no economist, but I would say having New Zealanders leave for their work to continue to create relationships with, whatever their work may be offshore is probably quite important. And so you just can't lock the borders down and expect every New Zealander to just stay here.
Are you still a member of the team of 5 million, Robyn?
Yeah, but I'm in the naughty corner.
Kia ora e te iwi e haere nei checkpoint. How have the DHBs coped with 30,000 nurses on strike? A murdered Northland woman allegedly warned she would die soon. Religious leaders spread the word about the COVID jab, that is. Homai o whakaaro. We would love to hear feedback on anything you've heard on the program so far tonight. Let's know what you think about Robyn Malcolm's comments on MIQ, scrappage for your car, that is the government paying you to get your petrol vehicle off the road, and also the Climate Commission report, or anything else that's on your mind. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can always send us an email. checkpoint@rnz.co.nz is the address. It is time for the headlines now with Marama.
Kia ora, a massive nurses' strike that's disrupted surgery services and COVID vaccination centres ends in under an hour and a half. Tens of thousands of nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants took to the streets around the country demanding better pay and conditions. District health boards say they're hoping to get back around the table with nurses after the strike is over. 3 people breached Melbourne's lockdown and travelled to Sydney and then on to Auckland last week. The COVID-19 response minister says they're having to spend 2 weeks in managed isolation, which they'll have to pay for. They've already tested negative once and their day 3 results are due back today. 2 quarantine-free flights are arriving in Auckland from Melbourne, carrying 450 passengers. One flight is due to touch down about now, and the other a little after midnight. Melbourne's hard lockdown will be eased from Friday. New Zealanders are being warned they'll have to make major changes to the way they live and work if this country is to hit its climate change targets. The Climate Change Commission's final report on becoming carbon neutral by 2050 includes the requirement for nearly all cars imported by 2035 to be electric vehicles. It also wants livestock numbers reduced. The police have confirmed a body found on Waiheke Island on Monday as that of a man who was reported missing late last month. Erno Bedo, who was 73, lived on a boat moored in Aotearoa Bay. Engineers are continuing to work through the latest survey of the Ashburton River Hakatere Bridge, which was damaged by flooding last week. Waka Kotahi says it will release an update about reopening the State Highway 1 bridge 24/7 to heavy vehicles by tomorrow afternoon.
Thanks, Marama. No mai hoki mai, this is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Nurses say they're working harder than ever and aren't getting a fair deal. 30,000 walked off the job today, demanding more money and safer workplaces. The strike's been running from 11 a.m. and will finish at 7 o'clock tonight. A backup plan had to be put in place to make sure care could be provided for those in need. The DHB's National Contingency Planner, Anne Aitchison, joins me now. Good evening, Anne.
Good evening.
Has your day gone without a hitch?
I wouldn't say without a hitch, but I think people have worked extremely hard to keep very busy hospitals operating.
So what have been the main challenges today?
Well, I think the fact that the hospitals are, at the beginning of the day, were much busier than had been intended. So there's very high acute demand, particularly for medical patients, and our EDs have remained very busy all day.
So what kind of, you say acute demand, what do you mean by that? Was that people turning up at the emergency departments or...?
Predominantly those presenting who have no choice but to receive care in a hospital environment, so acutely unwell patients.
What kind of numbers do you have, Anne, compared to a normal day in ED? What were you seeing?
Well, the numbers are about normal. I guess the issue is, of course, that when we plan for a period of industrial action, when staff are not going to be working, we would hope to reduce the number of patients in hospital to keep it safer. So we would look to be 80 to 85% occupied. And most hospitals this morning were closer to 100 or 110% full.
So what was your busiest at 110%? Which hospital?
More than one. And so, I think it would be fair to say we had 2 or 3 hospitals under 100%.
So which were your busiest hospitals then? If you had some that were over 100%, 110, which were they?
If you were to say which hospitals became quieter, we would talk about Wanganui or Taranaki. Bay of Plenty has reduced occupancy now, but most other hospitals in New Zealand are still sitting close to 100%.
Any patients put at risk as a consequence of staffing restrictions?
No, because a number of other measures have to be taken. So there are, obviously, we've cancelled elective surgery, we've cancelled outpatients clinics, all routine work has been cancelled so that those other people can be directed to work in our emergency departments and on the wards to try and manage the needs of the patients who must be there.
How are you going to catch that all up, Anne?
The recovery plans are always very, very challenging, and at this stage that will form part of the work the DHBs do in the days following industrial action.
How many elective surgeries and clinics were postponed as a result of this strike?
I can give you no figures of that at this point. We certainly collect that information. We collect the information in terms of how many people had services deferred, but that's not information that's usually available today.
So are you talking days to catch up, weeks or months?
Oh, months.
And so what pressure is that going to put on DHB resources?
It's always difficult to catch up. We're heading into winter, so while I talk to you about how busy the hospitals are with acute demand, we would be anticipating that to continue. That's why the recovery period takes longer in a winter period than it would in summer.
And what did you think of all the thousands of nurses out on the street, and some of them clearly very, very angry?
I'm a contingency planner. I have spent my day working in hospitals, with hospitals, trying to do the best we can to maintain services.
So you didn't think about them at all?
I have to be very concerned about the safety of those patients in the hospital, and that's the role that I fulfil with the DHBs.
Thank you for joining us, Anne. That is Anne Aitchison, who's the DHB's National Contingency Planner, and was overseeing that plan, the backup plan, while the nurses were on strike. It is time now for the business news with Nicholas Poynton. Hi, Nicholas.
Hello.
Let's talk about economic data. You've got a bit of it out today. What is it telling us about, where this economy is headed?
We had an avalanche of economic data that came out this morning, it felt like. If we can look to where it's pointing to, I'd say if there's one thing on the horizon, it is inflation. Because the first key piece of data we got out today was the BNZ Seek Employment Report. That's a measure of job ads, really. Yep. And it shows that for the third month in a row, job ads have hit a record high. They're up 5% on the previous month, but they're up more than 20% on where they were pre-COVID. And the real demand is coming for white-collar jobs such as in banking, government and real estate dominating. But also that surge that we saw in hospitality and tourism-related jobs in April, that seems to be petering out at the moment. But at the same time as we're seeing all this demand for labour, we're actually seeing fewer applications. There continues to be a lag in sort of applications versus job listings. That's been a trend we've seen over the past 3 months. There's a couple of reasons for this. The most obvious being that we have closed borders. Businesses are finding it really hard to be able to bring in that talent that they can't necessarily find in New Zealand. Why do they have to
bring it in?
That is a huge question that I'm unable to answer within the scope of our brief chat.
Nicholas.
But yeah, look, that's a problem that we've talked about for years, right? There are just clearly talent shortages that we're unable to fill on our own. But the other issue appears to be a theme that sort of emerged since the pandemic came along, and that, according to Seek, is that people appear to be prioritising job security more than they've ever done before when it comes to how they think about their job. It seems with all this uncertainty we're seeing in the economy at the moment, people are, they want to stay within a familiar environment where they feel secure, where they have a degree of certainty about, what comes each week and things like that. So all these factors come together. What it's really leading to, though, is higher wages for those people, as firms look to compete for what staff they can get their hands on here in New Zealand. The other key piece of data out today was the ANZ's preliminary survey of business confidence. The headline number dipped. That's as firms tend to be a bit more gloomy about the economic outlook for the country, but, and this always surprises me, firms are much more confident in their own outlook than they are in the outlook for the economy, and the result is somewhat striking because we are seeing the real intensification of inflationary pressures. We now have a net 85% of firms saying their costs are going up, and there are a myriad of reasons for this. One is really high global commodity prices, the other is disruption to supply chains, skills shortages, but also a higher minimum wage. We also now have 2/3 of firms saying that they now plan to pass on these costs to consumers. So apparently that's a record high according to the survey, a high that they haven't seen since 2000. So what this means for you and me is do not be surprised in the coming months when the goods we buy on a day-to-day basis begin to really increase in price because of these challenges. And the result will be that the RBNZ has an inflation target of between 1% and 3%, the midpoint being 2%. We've now seen inflation expectations at about 2.3%. Now the RBNZ says they've sort of expected there to be a sort of a blip as a result of these sort of various supply side disruptions, but how transitory it will be, we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, let's talk about, if we're talking about upward pressure, let's talk about wholesale power prices.
This is...
What's going on?
Yeah, the... generator and retailer Mercury Energy announced today that dry weather at its hydro plants in Taupō and the breakdown of its geothermal plant in Kawerau will affect how much power is actually available to generate. It's forecasting about a 5% drop at its Taupō catchment alone. And the worrying thing here is that it's unclear how long that outage at the Kawerau station will last. They said it could be anywhere, towards the end of their financial year or something like several months. And all of this contributed to the company cutting its full-year profit guidance from $520 to $460 million. And one of the real consequences here will be the effect that it has on wholesale power prices. Remember, previously we've spoken about how, and there have been stories about how spot wholesale power prices have been as much as 7% higher than they were ago. That is sort of a whole confluence of factors from dry weather, shortage of natural gas, and outages at the coal burning stations that are sort of brought on when there are shortages elsewhere in power generation. So all these things, previously we've heard stories about big users of electricity having to actually scale back production, or in some cases actually close because they cannot afford to operate. So this will be incredibly interesting to monitor in the coming weeks, and particularly keeping an eye on what happens with those spot prices.
Okay, let's take a trot around the markets. I see some pencil scribbles there, Nicholas.
Yeah, the NZX is up 49 points to 12,567. The dollar is at 72 US cents and 93 Australian.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with Business News. Pacific and Māori church leaders are stepping up in the battle against COVID-19 vaccination misinformation. A dozen senior Catholics from around the Wellington region received their first dose of the Pfizer vaccine this morning. The government wants religious heads to play an important role in spreading awareness and curbing any fears. RNZ Pacific's Adam Jacobson reports.
Rolling up their sleeves to get their community on board. Coletta Teofilo Konisi from Newtown's St Anne's Church, conquering her fear to protect her Samoan community.
I wanted to support my cardinal as well as the community of Samoa. Although I don't like needles, but for me now, I need to take it because for the safetyness of everyone.
Dr. Arete Metuamate, who's the chief executive of the Catholic Leadership Institute, admits Catholic church leaders are extremely concerned about misleading information being spread by some high-profile people, and it's especially problematic on social media.
Some of the stuff that I've seen is just borderline nuts. There's someone who's been suggesting that if you roll your sleeve up, you're rolling your sleeve up for Satan. So we can't quite work that one out.
So they're leading by example.
There's a Māori term called he ora te whakapiri, which means we are healthier if we come together. It's not just about me or my wife or my son or my auntie. It's actually about our whole community, and the most vulnerable in our community are the ones at risk if we don't get this vaccination.
Today's event focused specifically on Pacifica, a community where vaccine support is steadily rising, but is still lower than other demographics. Ministry of Health statistics show the number of Pacifica unsure about their vaccine has fallen from 32% to just 9%. Kapiti Church leader Lafayette Valelua says there are some concerns about the jab circulating in his community.
In the end, people need to be brave enough and come forward and accept the vaccination. It's about keeping positive messages across the country and from community and organisations and individuals.
Catholic Archbishop of Wellington Cardinal John Dew says the church wants to get the message out that the vaccine is safe.
It is a responsibility, as I've said, to make sure that you can be vaccinated, to keep safe for yourself and keep other members of your family and community safe.
A survey conducted earlier this year found safety and concerns about side effects are the key reasons for vaccine hesitancy. But church leaders say there's no reason not to.
A lot of you are getting in touch about our earlier interview, which was with the Motor Trade Association, and also about the Climate Commission's report. Now, the suggestion is that light petrol vehicles pretty much phase out the imports by early 2030s to really slash our emissions. Mixed response here. MTA is saying that government should potentially pay for scrappage. That is, you get a fee for dumping your old petrol car 15 years or more. This person says, Lewis says, predictable response from the NTA to Climate Commission's report. Their suggested solution to reduce emissions is to subsidise motor vehicles more. Peter says, my car is 8 years old. It's a Leaf. If I had bought it in the UK, it would have a battery warranty and have been 30% cheaper. Car has done over 40,000 Ks in the last 2 years. Highly recommend, but wish we didn't have to rely on imports. John says, great plan. Let's go back to the 80s when only the rich were able to have a car. By the way, buddy, there is virtually no public transport in most of this country. Good point, John. They want you to use the bus. They want bus use rates to more than double in the next 10 years. So that's interesting if you don't really have a bus service to get on. Tess says, I'd swap my old petrol car for a second-hand EV. And another listener says, 15 years old? That means the car I bought a year ago for $12,000 has 3 years left of life for a rebate of $1,000. Get real. Keep your feedback coming. It is 10 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. He Moriaki in Pita Pita Kōrero after the news at 6. How expensive would petrol need to be to stop you driving your car? You can let us know about that too. Text us on 2101. Northland woman Bridget Simmons warned she would soon die just before she went missing. The 42-year-old mother of two disappeared in March 2019 and her partner at the time is on trial for her murder. The Crown alleges he punched Ms Simmons and hit her with a tree branch for up to 90 minutes, then buried her body. Sam Ollie was in court in Whangarei today and a warning, this report includes disturbing details of violence.
Bridget Simmons' remains were found buried in a shallow grave this time last year, more than 15 months after she was last seen alive. Her mother, Carol Callan, last saw her daughter in February 2019, about 2 weeks before she went missing. Ms Simmons had been staying with her and asked to be dropped off at a Countdown supermarket in Whangarei. Today, Ms Callan told the High Court her daughter yelled something at her as she drove away, but she couldn't make it out at the time.
Got in the car and drove, and after about half an hour's driving, I was trying to figure out in my head what she yelled at me, and I suddenly clicked, oh my God, she said, don't forget my headstone.
Carol Callan says her daughter came to stay after a Valentine's Day beating that left her legs covered in bruises from the waist to the knees.
Black and blue and red, and I was quite worried because she's actually on blood thinners for a medical problem, and I thought, oh my goodness, look at all that internal bleeding.
Senior Constable Joanne Rouse spoke to Ms Simmons after this assault. The jury was shown photos police took of her injuries.
To me it looked worse than those photos. It was like weeping in the corner and she couldn't open her eye.
Samuel Poe admitted causing these injuries at a pre-trial appearance. Crown Prosecutor Mike Smith read an agreed summary of facts that said in the Valentine's Day beating, Mr Poe tried to gouge out Bridget Simmons' eyes and punched her ribs to stop her screaming. He said she saw a GP the next day.
It was discovered that her left cornea was ripped and hanging off. The victim had lost vision in her left eye. The doctor was of the opinion that a lot of pressure would have been required to cause such an injury. Further, something would have had to enter right into the eye socket to damage the eye in that way. The doctor also observed that the victim's face was very swollen and bruised, and that she had pain on the right side of her ribs.
Carol Callan walked out of the public gallery when the details of her daughter's abuse were read. Samuel Poe stayed silent and expressionless throughout. Justice Christine Gordon told the jury Mr Poe's past attacks did not mean he was necessarily guilty of murdering Bridget Simmons in a final fatal attack. She said it was up to them to decide whether he showed a pattern of behaviour.
The defence position is that the evidence does not demonstrate such a tendency and the evidence is not relevant to causation. If you do find that the evidence in the summaries of facts establishes the tendency that the Crown says it does, then you may give whatever weight you think fit in deciding on the murder charge.
At least 40 witnesses are expected to take the stand over the next 3 weeks.
In Australia, a trial has been floated to put a sticker on dairy products to help shoppers identify if farmers are being paid a fair price. But the trial risks being thwarted because of opposition from large milk processors. The ABC's Isabel Rowe reports.
Just 2 years ago, a grassroots campaign in support of dairy farmers helped convince supermarkets to ban $1 a litre milk. But much of the passion seems to have worn off, at least for these shoppers in South Brisbane.
Definitely the size versus price. Like if it's a small milk and it's like $6 versus like a bigger milk that's like $3, obviously I'm going to choose the bigger one.
I try not to take the lowest, depend on the difference and stuff.
I'm not rich, so I just buy cheaper one.
Nevertheless, the Queensland Dairy Farmers Organisation is still trying to encourage milk drinkers to buy brands that best support the rapidly declining industry. In March, the competition watchdog, the ACCC, approved a 5-year trial of their proposed scheme called Fair Go Dairy. It'd mean milk processors could display a sticker on their dairy products if they paid their farmers above 73 cents a litre for their milk, among other conditions. The average price Queensland farmers are getting now is 68 cents a litre. President of the Queensland Dairy Farmers Organisation, Brian Tessman, says that still isn't sustainable.
The purpose of it is then the consumer would know that if they buy that milk with that sticker on it, they are supporting those dairy farmers, and those dairy farmers are getting a sustainable price.
The trial was ready to launch this month until a group of large dairy processors, the Australian Dairy Products Federation, launched an appeal. The federation argues the scheme would discriminate against milk processors who might pay their farmers well but choose not to partake, and says it'd interfere in the market. But smaller dairy processors don't buy that.
They fear what this transparency could mean for their own businesses.
Sarah Booker, who owns Mulaney Cheese, says while her business would qualify for the scheme, most bigger companies wouldn't.
We accordingly actually increased what we paid our dairy farmers considerably just in March last year. Once again, we as a small dairy processor are being cornered by the large-scale national or international processors.
The ACCC found the Fair Go Dairy sticker would provide a small degree of benefit by telling consumers more about what they're buying. But retail expert from the Queensland University of Technology, Professor Gary Mortimer, argues there's little evidence such schemes work.
While we all have great intentions to be ethical consumers, unfortunately in a supermarket setting we tend to simply buy the same products we buy every week.
It's cold comfort for the dairy industry, which has more than halved in size nationwide over the past 20 years, as farms struggle to remain viable.
Get vaccinated or face losing your job. Several health workers in Houston, Texas have chosen the latter, joining supporters in protest. Meanwhile, Norwegian cruise liners in Florida are threatening to defy state laws by requiring vaccines before passengers board ships. Both cases add to the growing debate of personal rights versus public safety, as CNN's Erica Hill reports.
Support for healthcare workers in Texas refusing to get the COVID-19 vaccine.
We should be allowed to make our own decisions.
Staffers at Houston Methodist Hospital had until yesterday to get vaccinated. More than 100 employees filed a lawsuit last month citing concerns over the vaccine's emergency use authorization rather than full FDA approval. The hospital's chief executive pushing back.
These are remarkably safe. We're not making anybody take the vaccine. What we're saying is that in order to care for our patients and work at our institution, you have to have the vaccine. If that is something you're not comfortable with, of course, you can exercise that choice and you can move someplace else.
The decision to require vaccines playing out in businesses large and small nationwide. Norwegian Cruise Line ready to set sail from Miami in August. All passengers must be fully vaccinated. A direct challenge to Governor Ron DeSantis, who has barred Florida businesses from requiring proof of vaccination.
Freedom over I want to be able to celebrate.
Bruce Springsteen is back on Broadway at the end of the month.
Kindness, optimism, civility.
Tickets for the fully vaccinated only, as New York City marks a vaccine milestone.
More vaccinations have been given in New York City than there are people in New York City. That's a great, great sign.
Statewide, nearly 70% of adult New Yorkers have had at least one shot. In West Virginia, it's barely 50%.
I just don't get it. I really don't get it. We've got to get vaccinated. That's all there is to it.
A new CDC study finds fully vaccinated people are more than 90% protected from infection. And even if infected, their symptoms are more mild and they're less likely to spread the disease. Meantime, the administration tempering expectations on its looming goal to get at least one shot in 70% of adults by next month.
July 4th is not the end of it.
Well, lots of feedback still coming in on the issue of petrol cars and getting rid of them. By early 2030s, a ban potentially. Climate Commission has recommended this. This person says, I'd only ditch my car if I could get something I liked that is equivalent on performance. But I can't because the electric alternatives are far too expensive and at the same time downright ugly. I'll keep my carbon footprint, this person says. Another person's got an old Toyota, 1998, says absolutely I'd take a rebate. Big reason I've kept my 98 Toyota is waiting to afford an electric vehicle or a hybrid. This is exactly what I need, they say. Another person says, with the government pushing for a move away from petrol cars, what happens to vintage vehicles? Good point. I own a collection of vintage vehicles. Is the government going to force me to sell them?
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, I'm Marama Tipole. Hospitals around the country have been flat out today, with all but a handful operating at close to maximum capacity, if not more. This is despite trying to keep numbers down, while nurses were on strike by cancelling routine and non-urgent appointments. About 30,000 nurses, midwives and other health workers walked off the job at 11 o'clock this morning. The National Contingency Planner for DHBs, Anne Aitchison, has told Checkpoint hospitals tried to reduce capacity, but it was a busy day.
So we would look to be 80 to 85% occupied, and most hospitals this morning were closer to 100 or 110% full. I mean, I think it would be fair to say we had 2 or 3 hospitals under 100%.
Anne Atchison says it will take months to catch up on the backlog of rescheduled appointments and surgery. A Hamilton nurse on strike, Kate, says she's marching to ensure future generations can enjoy a more positive environment.
I'm here for my daughters and for the young nurses that to have a career that really works for them and their families. And I've been a nurse for so many years now, about 40 years, and I just want the young ones coming behind to have something that they feel proud about and come to.
The 8-hour strike ends at 7 p.m. Critics say the Climate Change Commission has missed the mark on methane targets in its final advice to the government. In a report handed to Parliament today, the Commission suggests petrol and diesel cars are rapidly phased out and asks for substantially more investment in public transport, cycle paths and walkways, among other recommendations. Oxfam spokesperson Alex Johnson says the targets for agriculture are too soft. He says New Zealand is not going to do its fair share to mitigate global warming if it doesn't directly regulate agriculture. A distribution hub will be set up in Christchurch to deliver COVID-19 vaccines throughout the South Island. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the hub will be operating by July, when larger shipments of the Pfizer vaccine will be flown directly to both Auckland and Christchurch. He says the government has bought 17 ultra-low temperature freezers to help store the doses, of which 5 are in Christchurch.
That will allow us to establish a new Christchurch distribution hub, which will be able to receive vaccines directly rather than them all coming through Auckland, and it will increase our ability to spread that load.
Chris Hipkins says having 2 vaccination hubs and backup freezers prepares New Zealand for any potential risks. Armed police officers are investigating a fatal apparent hit and run in the Auckland suburb of Mangere, in which a firearm might have been involved. The police received multiple reports of a man being hit by a vehicle on Thomas Road just before midday. Jean Bell reports.
The vehicle fled the area immediately after hitting the man. Emergency services attempted to save him, but he died shortly after. A firearm might have been involved in the hit and run, and armed police officers attended as a precaution. This afternoon, the police have been at an address in the Mangere area and are speaking with numerous people there. No firearm has been found so far. The police are calling on anyone who witnessed the incident to come forward.
A Northland mother has described her final days with her daughter before she went missing. Bridget Simmons disappeared in March 2019, aged 42. She was the partner of Samuel Hemwera-Po, who was on trial in Whangarei, accused of her murder. Today, Carol Callan told the High Court at Whangarei her daughter's legs were black and blue with bruises when she last saw her. She says Bridget Simmons warned her she would soon die, shouting, "Don't forget my headstone," as they went separate ways from a supermarket. At least 40 witnesses are expected to take the stand over the next 3 weeks. An investigation has been launched in the US into the tax records of the country's richest people, in which appears to show many have paid little or no income tax in recent years. According to the news outlet ProPublica, the 25 wealthiest Americans pay tax at a lower rate than the average worker. The billionaires include Amazon founder Jeff Bezos and Tesla boss Elon Musk. The BBC's Peter Bowes reports.
ProPublica, a New York-based investigative website, says the tax returns of those people are not suggesting that they did anything illegal, but the analysis of the data shows that they, to use an expression, played the system. The American household, on average, over the last few years has paid about 14%. These super rich, the top 25, paid the equivalent of about 3.4%.
It's 6:05. To sports, despite being the defending champions, Queensland are claiming underdog status ahead of tonight's State of Origin Rugby League Series opener in Townsville. New Maroons coach Paul Green maintains New South Wales have a better team on paper, while Queensland have several injury concerns.
In terms of training, we haven't had a full week's prep with guys in different positions. So it is what it is, though. They're experienced. They know what they have to do come game day. So part of the, I suppose, challenge from a coaching point of view is how you bring that group together. It's really happy with where we're at. We've done some good work back end of the week.
The match kicks off at 10:10. The Black Caps are set to make several changes for the second and deciding cricket test against England, with captain Kane Williamson under an injury cloud and other players being rested ahead of the World Test Championship final. The second test starts in Birmingham tomorrow night ahead of the Test Championship final against India in Southampton. Pace bowler Trent Boult is set to return, while Mitchell Santner is out with injury. Meanwhile, England veteran fast bowler James Anderson says players have accepted Ollie Robinson's apology for racist and sexist comments he posted on social media as a teenager.
I remember being that age, and you do make mistakes, and you may be a little bit, you're very young and inexperienced. And I think it's just a case of trying to make sure that even at that age, we try and send the message that this is unacceptable.
Cricket website Wisden reports the England Cricket Board is also investigating a second player for historical offensive social media posts. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
For the public to stand with us, that we're fighting here for a quality of healthcare service that recognises the value and resources and importance of nursing.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
The maritime archaeologists have said that the site is just way too dynamic, and we'll probably end up with those pieces back on the shore again.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. Northland, Auckland, also Coromandel Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Cloudy periods with a few light showers clearing for Hawke's Bay tonight. Waikato to Manawatu, including the central high country. Fine, partly cloudy tomorrow with a chance of a shower. Horowhenua to Wellington, also Wairarapa, fine. Cloudy tomorrow with showers from the afternoon. Nelson, Marlborough, Bulla and Westland, fine. Partly cloudy tomorrow as well. A few showers about Golden Bay and the Marlborough Sounds. Canterbury and Otago, fine. Clouds spreading north tomorrow with drizzle developing inland Canterbury tomorrow evening. Southland and Fiordland, fine, but some cloud and drizzle about the fjords. Rain developing everywhere tomorrow morning, gradually clearing but remaining rather cloudy. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 6:08.
Kia ora rā e ho. Nau mai hoki mai if you're just joining us. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. The Climate Commission has stressed a need for the country to work harder to significantly reduce emissions, but how it's achieved has divided Parliament. The Commission has released its final report into how much the country will need to drop emissions over the next 15 years, but its recommendations on agriculture and electric vehicles have ruffled feathers. Political reporter Charlie Drever was at the release of today's report and filed this report.
The world young people will inherit, front of mind for Climate Change Minister James Shaw today.
The emissions that have the biggest long-term impact on global temperatures hang around in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so, to achieve the emissions reductions that the Commission proposes for the second half of this decade and beyond, we need to act now.
Thanks to new data that shows emissions have continued to rise, the Commission is recommending moving faster to cut emissions. By 2035, long-lived greenhouse gases would need to drop by 63% and biogenic methane by 17%. Jacinda Ardern says today's report is possibly one of the most important documents she will receive as Prime Minister.
Climate change is my generation's nuclear-free moment. And perhaps even more so, it's the next generation's nuclear-free moment too. And today is a huge milestone in a movement and in a transition that we must make.
However, she hasn't convinced Generation Zero's Grace Cowley.
This is lip service to what people would say would be a nuclear-free moment.
Environmental groups reckon the report did not go far enough, in particular with agriculture and conservation. Reducing stock was noted, but no recommendations were made about individual farms or animal numbers. Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngāriwa-Paka told the House the elephant in the room is being ignored.
Mr Speaker, the truth is simple and staring us all in the face. Even if the government and the minister fails to acknowledge it, we need less cows. We need less cows in this country. We must reduce our herd sizes.
National broadly supported the emission targets set out by the Commission, but its climate change spokesperson, Stuart Smith, is concerned about biogenic methane targets, which are now slightly more ambitious than in the Zero Carbon Act.
It was a very challenging target anyway, so that's going to be pretty tough now. So can they get there? Don't know.
He says emission targets can mostly be met with an emissions trading scheme. The report also suggests banning imports or the manufacture of cars with internal combustion engines by 2035 and the introduction of direct subsidies or a fee-based scheme for electric alternatives. But ACT Party leader David Seymour isn't keen.
I would love a Tesla, but at $71,000 they're out of reach for me and, dare I say it, most New Zealand families.
He says the government can't ban and tax itself out of climate change.
If we want to reduce our emissions, they should set a cap on emissions for all New Zealanders and let families and businesses choose how to operate within that limit, not try and make a budget and a micromanagement plan for every industry.
The government will now use the Commission's final advice to publish an action plan by the end of the year.
In breaking news, there's a new community case of COVID-19 in the state of Queensland. The 44-year-old woman travelled from Victoria through New South Wales and crossed the border into Queensland on Saturday. The woman, who was staying with her husband and other family members in Caloundra, was tested yesterday with a positive result confirmed this afternoon. Since the weekend, she has visited a number of sites, including a shopping centre, McDonald's, petrol station and 2 cafes. Now, let's head back to the Climate Commission's report. Professor Dave Frame is the director of the New Zealand Climate Change Research Institute at Victoria University. He says transport emissions are on the way up and motorists need to be targeted.
So transport's a hard sector, but it's an important sector. And politically, it's a tricky sector because there's so many motorists. So fuel lifting, putting fuel surcharges in place or lifting the price of petrol is a proven vote loser. So it's actually quite a hard sector to make much progress in. I think by trying to make public transport much more attractive, by investing more in it, by trying to get stuff onto the rail network, they have some potentially positive things to do, but they will need at some point to be disincentivising petrol car use as well as just, otherwise the ban in 2030, whatever, just it is not so credible. That ban will only stick if petrol vehicles are fairly unattractive at that point.
Is telling people to ditch their petrol cars, is that a vote-losing policy?
Well, it depends. It depends on what the alternatives are and how attractive they are. Right now, it would be. If you ban petrol cars tomorrow, that would just not stick.
But we're talking a decade, so is that a long enough lead-in?
Not really. Well, at least who knows? But our vehicle fleet is one of the oldest in the OECD because we buy second-hand vehicles from overseas. So what you really want is a generation of. If we continue to do that. Then you would need a generation of vehicles to pass through that we then buy second-hand or whatever. So it's a very short turnaround, and it either implies quite large subsidies to pull those vehicles through, or major technological changes so that those vehicles are being produced much more cheaply than today. That's possible, but it's sort of unproven.
Yeah, because the Commission reckons there'll be price parity between an EV and a petrol car by about 2031. Do you not buy that?
Well, there may be, but the further you gaze out into the distance, the trickier it is. And one of the things that the Commission has received some criticism for is its sort of defensiveness and opacity around its economic modelling. So if they're right about that, then that may well be an attractive thing to do. But if you look at the long tail of vehicles in New Zealand, we have an abnormally high number of vehicles that are over 15 years old. That price parity in 2031 doesn't necessarily translate into the New Zealand road fleet being low carbon by 2035.
On alternative travel, right, so low carbon, using your legs or getting on a bus, right, the Commission would like the number of kilometres travelled from cycling to, almost triple, and then they've got, public transport, they'd like you to travel twice the distance you're travelling on public transport at the moment. I mean, how realistic is that? Because we've been trying to drum this message into people for years. What makes them think that, because they say it's going to happen?
That is where it depends on the sticks as well as the carrots. So if it's much more expensive to drive a vehicle, people probably will choose alternatives. Whether they're happy doing so is a different matter. But if you make
So name me one stick that you would implement to make them get out of the car tomorrow and catch the bus.
Vehicle emissions testing and a fuel surcharge to more closely reflect the actual price of carbon on their CO2 emissions.
So how much on fuel would you tack on top?
Well, that would be something you'd have to work on. But at the moment, the ETS has a price of a few cents, and I think it would need to be a lot more than that. So modelling we did last year suggested to make the cuts that you want from the transport sector by 2030 under the old climate target would add another $1 to the petrol price. Now, I don't think that would work. But I think that some sort of emissions-based surcharge on fuel would be a good thing. But I wouldn't suggest going all the way up to $1 because I just don't think it would stick. But I would suggest something in that area to disincentivise the use of petrol cars. New Zealanders drive some pretty unnecessarily big vehicles.
So, Dave, what do you reckon the sweet spot is? If it's not a buck, is 50 cents not enough to hurt? Or is 75 cents the sweet spot, or what?
No, I'd probably start with more like 10 or 20, but because people are very sensitive to fuel prices. But I would also do things with the tax and benefit system because simply a fuel surcharge would hurt poorer people disproportionately. I think there are things you could do with land taxes that would also address, to some extent, wealth inequality, which is a burgeoning problem in New Zealand as well. So depending on exactly what policy areas you wanted to couple up, you could do quite a lot. But something I think is important is that the vision in this document is a transformational change. Yet many of the areas in it are subject to, the discussions are subject to, are about things like, as you said, massive scaling up of cycling and active transport and public transport. But how are we going to get there? And that's where it's the coupling between policies and making the low carbon option more attractive that it's really all about. And there, I just don't think that a small commission with a universal mandate is able to do all that joining up because it doesn't really have complete line of sight over any one sector, let alone all of them interacting together.
And that was Professor Dave Frame there. And we're getting an absolute flood of feedback on this. We've got very strong opinions on it. Richard's got in touch to ask, why aren't our buses electric? It would seem the most simple list of vehicle fleet to convert to electricity. While we do have some electric buses here in Auckland, don't know so much about the rest of the country. Ian says the Motor Trade Association is angling for more business by suggesting that we should cut our emissions by tuning and emissions testing our existing fleet. He was simply not credible, says Ian. That's interesting, Ian, because Professor Dave Frame just said the same thing, that he reckons emission testing is the way to go too. Paul says we have no option to be delayed on getting to zero carbon. We have no time. The planet is dying around us. If we don't have enough, we have to get rid of existing stock and get on the bus or bike. Ben says, we just bought a new EV. It would have been nice to wait for the fee bait, but someone has to take the first step. Katie says, how about regulating all new fleet vehicles for car hire companies have to be replaced only with hybrid or EV vehicles? Shane in Hastings says, I'd be really keen to swap to an EV vehicle. This is the inevitable future we have in front of us. Let's just get on with it, start planning for change, and let's all jump on board, says Shane. Jim says, I've got a 15-year-old SUV that is still manufactured today, not much changed, no gain from scrapping my vehicle. Better to focus on gas guzzlers and Remawera trucks. 15-year-old SUV, wouldn't that fall into that category, Jim? Anyway. Dangerous staffing levels, which are leaving nurses fearing for their patients. This issue came up again and again at today's countrywide strike by DHB nurses. Up to 30,000 DHB nurses went on strike seeking better staffing levels, 5 more sick days and a 17% pay rise. Rachel Graham has more.
As nurses streamed from Christchurch Public Hospital at 11 a.m, workmates and supporters waiting for them across the road at Hagley Park let out a huge cheer. Nurse Carmen Brown says walking away from their patients for the 8-hour strike was emotional.
We've all crossed the road, we've all had tears in our eyes, we haven't taken it lightly. You leave your patient care behind, which is not something that's natural for us, and it's really sad that it's come to this, but I feel really empowered to stand with these amazing people in a profession that we've chosen and we give so much of ourselves to, and we're just really grateful for any support that we get from the public. Yeah.
In Wellington, Brian Tian, a clinical nurse coordinator and registered nurse, says nurses have lost faith in both the union and DHBs to ensure safe staffing levels.
I coordinate pretty much every day now with 3 to 4 nurses down, and we're usually 16 staff, and it's just wrong. Like, I'm burnt out, I'm finding it hard to cope, and this is going to be the future of nursing too, because we've got a shortage of staffing now. People aren't going to want to get into the profession.
Brian's encouraging nurses to move to Australia if they can, because he fears conditions will not improve here. That's exactly what these 2 young nurses from Dunedin are considering doing.
If nothing changes, then I think it's across the ditch or somewhere else, definitely.
And they've got patient ratios, 1 nurse, 4 patients all day and night. It's pretty amazing, not 1 to 11 on a night shift. Pretty good. This is a career that I think both of us love, but it's just, it's every day's chaos, so ready for some change.
Debbie Robinson's an intensive care nurse who spent more than 3 decades at Dunedin Hospital. She says nurses made huge sacrifices to provide care during the height of the pandemic last year, and they want to be recognised for those efforts.
There was nurses in Dunedin Hospital that left their families so that they wouldn't take anything back if they did get something, and that was here. So, I think it underlines the importance of what we do and that we care enormously. It's not easy to go on strike.
The organiser of the nurses' strike in Hamilton says the decision to march wasn't made lightly. The nationwide protest comes as Waikato DHB continues to struggle weeks after a cyber attack crippled their IT systems. Fiona Sysom says despite the chaos, they had no other choice.
It was a really tough decision for us to continue. We were asked by the DHB to not go ahead with the strike. Even though it's a difficult time, it's actually the most important time to stand up, because we're fighting for the nursing profession. We're fighting for the future of all of New Zealand.
Kevin Dunseith was standing near Waikato Hospital with a sign that read Kia kaha nurses when he spotted the very group of nurses he was striking for.
These nurses looked after my dad. She looked after my dad. She looked after my dad for months and months. Jean, thank you.
He says nurses desperately need better working conditions.
All of these nurses need more money, they need better support, and they don't get looked after. They need to be these are essential workers.
The strike will continue until 7 p.m. tonight, and after that, the union says they will resume negotiations with the DHBs.
It's 25 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The international sting that's led to the arrest of 800 people in 18 countries has been described as a worldwide takedown of criminal syndicates. Gangs were tricked into using an FBI-run secure messaging app which allowed police to monitor millions of messages. The BBC's Gordon Carrera has more.
A shipment of tuna cans coming from Ecuador into Europe with more than 600 kilos of cocaine hidden inside, all discovered by law enforcement. More cocaine wrapped up with a Batman label, a picture of it sent on a phone that criminals thought was secure, but which was really a trap. That trap was sprung today as law enforcement around the world made their move with a wave of arrests against multiple organised crime groups. Criminals believed that using a system called Anom secured their communications. The problem was that the person behind it was an undercover informant for the FBI. They started by giving 50 devices to criminals in Australia, people like Hakan Ayek, now on the run, who in turn recommended it to others, unwittingly helping the authorities. So how did it all work? The system was run by the FBI and Australian Federal Police, who were able to access communications between 10,000 devices. 20 million messages were intercepted from more than 90 countries. Details about drug deals, money laundering and planned murders were accessed. It was effectively a wiretap on the criminal underworld around the globe. The biggest users of the device were in Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Serbia and Australia. There are some investigations in the UK, although the device was not widely used here.
The amount of intelligence that we received was staggering. From seizing drugs, guns, and millions of dollars in multiple currencies, to addressing more than 150 threats to life.
In Australia, there have been more than 200 arrests. Police say the information even helped thwart a machine gun attack in a cafe. And in Europe today, there was more evidence of the operation's success.
For 9 months, we have been receiving intelligence to build criminal cases. And we have also had information that has helped us to prevent more than 10 planned murders within Sweden.
This operation has dealt a serious blow to organised crime, not only because of those arrested, but because those still at large will not be sure who or what they can trust.
There's growing frustration in the UK after the government removed Portugal from the list of safe countries to travel to. Anyone returning from there now has to quarantine for 10 days. The BBC's Caroline Davies reports.
The deep blues of Greece's islands, the Mediterranean coves in Spain, and the sun-drenched beaches of Portugal. All now on the amber list, legal to go to but against government advice. There were few passengers heading out this morning from Gatwick.
I just think they should have made it red or green. You know, you can either go or you can't.
Well, to be fair, I haven't seen my family for a while, so I would be going anyway regardless.
Psychologically, I really feel that I need to go.
Gatwick is very quiet today. There are only around 60 or so flights in and out. The industry had never thought it was going to reach 2019 passenger levels. Many people will choose to stay in the UK this year, but it also hadn't predicted there would be so few countries on the green list, and it's still trying to work out how that affects its operations.
Operators are deciding whether to fly to amber list countries anyway. Jet2 has currently decided it won't.
A family of four coming back having all those tests, it's a lot of money. People can't afford it. And also, it's all right for white-collar workers saying, oh, well, I work from home for 10 days in quarantine. If you're a hospitality worker, a supermarket worker, you can't do that. So, therefore, it's just a non-starter for a lot of our customers.
Other operators like TUI, EasyJet and Ryanair are flying to amber destinations, although flights aren't full. Ministers today said that people should not be travelling there for holidays.
Many people, myself included, are coming to the conclusion that we should all be staying home and enjoying the beautiful weather here in the UK. You should not be travelling to countries on that amber list or the red list.
The industry says it's causing more confusion.
Well, I can think of no better reason for UK citizens to travel abroad to Europe this summer other than to avoid the incompetent ministers there who'll be holidaying at home. Why are these government ministers telling vaccinated British citizens and their families that they should stay at home? It's mindless and it makes no sense.
The next review of countries to go on the list will happen in less than 3 weeks' time. But at the moment, the industry feels the tide is pulling against them.
And that's pretty much all we've got time for this evening. Have a great night. I'll be back same place tomorrow. Thanks, Lisa. RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Hospitals will spend months catching up on appointments and surgeries that had to be postponed today due to the nurses' strike.
The MTA wants the government to make it easy to trade in gas-guzzling cars for more environmentally friendly vehicles in light of